Hey, this is Writers Row. I'm DC Wright-Hammer. I've got a very special guest for this show, and he's got something he wants to tell you about.
Yeah, welcome all. This is CD Tavenor. I am a science fiction and fantasy author, and yeah, I guess so. What DC Wright-Hammer is talking about is me wanting me to just right after the top of the show just mention the upcoming Gaia Awakens, a climate crisis anthology, which is a climate fiction project that a bunch of independent authors have all worked on together to reveal to the world. It's an anthology, however, every single story is in the same universe. Also, for the writers who are listening, we will be doing a call for submissions at some point in the future for more stories, so keep an eye out for that.
And there'll be a link in the description for people who want to pre-order that for when it comes out, and we'll go from there. So I brought CD, and it's kind of funny, CD, DC. Don't get confused.
You can just call me Tavenor.
Tavenor. Brought him on the show. I started writing fantasy for those who do know, or for those who don't. I have written 2 science fiction, thriller, speculative fiction novels, and I'm starting my first fantasy novel. So I wanted to bring Tavenor on to talk about why science fiction and fantasy get lumped together, why authors often bleed into both of those genres, and so on. So I guess, yeah, let's start at the top. First off, why, you've got science fiction, which is futuristic. You got fantasy, which is often, the opposite of futuristic. It's in the past, but not always. Why are these 2 genres, which, in your opinion, why are they always lumped together?
I think the reason why they're lumped together is because fundamentally they're actually asking the same questions. Science fiction usually is grounded more in our reality. It is taking from technology that we have, or speculative ideas about what the future could be like, or facts about the world that we know, like the fact that there's lots of other planets and stars out in space, and creating human experiences with those things. And that's what science fiction is doing. But the question it's asking is, how will humans interact with things that they don't currently interact with? I think that's like fundamentally the question at the core is humans can't currently interact with a conscious AI or go to Mars. Maybe we'll do the Mars thing soon, but those are things we can't do right now. And so you're asking a question, how would humans interact with one another and that technology or that experience? And I think fantasy is answering the exact same question, just in a different trapping. It's how would humans interact if magic was real? How would humans interact with one another if, gods were fighting each other in the sky and were impacting the world in really significant ways? It's the same question, just with a different trappings around it.
Yeah, and it's really about the unknown, right? Because we didn't live, in the past, like we all live now, like the oldest person, whatever, 100 years old, 112. We have a lot of modern, accounts. We have a lot of, historical documents, things that can tell us a lot about it, but there's still the unknown. There's still the gaps, the day-to-day, the unexplained phenomena that happen. And, then you flip that into the future. The future is completely, we've got an idea of where we're going to go. But if you look at, we're supposed to have flying cars by now. We were supposed to have, surfboard, the floating surfboards and all that, all these things people take this guess about the unknown. And I think, it answers those questions. But what I like about both science fiction and fantasy is they don't try to be in the ones that I've read, and a lot of the more commonly consumed science fiction and fantasy, they leave as many questions as they attempt to answer. And I think that's actually really cool, a cool thing that we can do. So, I guess, being that we think, we're answering the same fundamental questions with sci-fi and fantasy, is that why you think a lot of authors tend to expand from one to the other? I mean, you've got like Robert Heinlein. He started, he did sci-fi, but he also did some fantasy. George R.R. Martin actually started in science fiction and went into fantasy. Do you think that's why they do that?
Yeah, I think and another good example, Ursula K. Le Guin hopped back and forth between sci-fi and fantasy, and yeah, I think you're flexing similar skills. I mean, like when you're in storytelling, you are taking a situation that is not grounded in our current reality, and or in some instances you might be going into the past. Some instances you might be placing the story on Earth. I think, you know, like thinking about Artemis Fowl is like a great fantasy setting that occurs on Earth, but there's a whole hidden world sort of thing, and you're exploring these questions and these character interactions where you can just throw people into really, really crazy situations and think about how would a human or a person, depending on if you have aliens or like other, you know, fantasy races or whatever. And you're thinking about how would they interact in these situations? How would people be stretched in their human experience, into how they interact with other people?
I think for me, with the speculative fiction that I write, there's so many guardrails and so much, like, to make it believable and make it truly speculative, like you can't have the reader, you can't force them to suspend too much disbelief, right? You have to sort of stick to, you know, so like what I did is I took the current technology, what do I think the next step of the current technology is? But then that was as far as I could take it. And like, when you got into some of the like underground, top secret things, you can push that even a little bit further, like, oh, here's the next thing. But at a certain point, like, you know, the believability makes it difficult, you know, sort of reels in the creativity to some extent. And what I found, some of that is true in the fantasy that I started writing, where, you know, at a certain, you know, if you just magic this, magic that, it gets a little unruly and hard to follow. But I do find fantasy a little bit more freeing. You can use supernatural elements. You don't have to explain everything with fantasy. And that's been really fun for me to just kind of take it and run with it in that sense, and take it into a lot of different directions. I think when I start editing and getting into it in that way, I will put my own guardrails on some of the supernatural elements. But for now, I'm just having a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that's the fun part of it is also, I think, one of the reasons is that, but in the end, I think science fiction, and some really, really hard science fiction fans are probably going to be mad at me for saying this, but I would say almost every science fiction novel ends up bleeding a little bit into fantasy, because so many sci-fi novels, unless you are trying to stay strictly in that hard sci-fi genre, end up introducing something that, at least as we commonly understand, is actually impossible. So like, right, the best example is like faster than light travel in a lot of space sci-fi settings. You're just like, well, I'm just going to make up something that's kind of like a magic system so that they can get where they need to go, right, in the amount of time I need them to get there. But I think that's the beauty of like this style of writing, is that you're building a framework in which your characters can interact with each other. Right. That can be a lot of fun, and hard sci-fi can be a lot of fun too. I think the Expanse does have a little bit of a fantasy element to it, but like, one of the reasons why people love it so much is how seriously they took the laws of physics and gravity in creating that setting.
Well, and I read probably too much Michael Crichton, and same, you know, he you know, would have scholarly journals cited in his fiction novels that he was writing, you know, where he really was trying to predict to some extent what the future looked like. And
he made some of those up too, though. He also used them as a fictional trapping of his stories, which is also one of the beauties of that style of like fiction as well.
And what was it? Was it State of Fear? Was that the name of the one where it seemed like he got paid by big oil to basically just kind of, you know, discredit? Anyway, I digress. Don't want to get too political on this episode, but I think
why not?
No, but I think what I've appreciated, and I've read A Song of Ice and Fire, the 5 books in that series, it's still character driven, right? That was the cool part about, you know, because my science fiction thrillers are character driven. The first one is written in the first person, so it's very limited perspective. And what is this person? How are they going from point A, their long winding journey to the end, and what does that look like? And so I really appreciate this character-driven sort of narrative that still feels big and expansive. You got this big world with these laws and everything, but you still feel like the smallest little dialogue is that much more important.
Yeah, and I think one of the beauties of fantasy in particular is that it allows writers to create almost like a modern myth. Tolkien actually talks about this, is that his goal was to create like a modern mythology for England, because he felt like England as a people didn't really have any sort of grounding mythology. Now, people who were original peoples of England prior to the Anglo-Saxon invasion might disagree with him on that, but like he was creating like mythology for these languages and all these sorts of things. And it creates these universal like truths and stories. I mean, there's a reason why a hero's journey appears so often in fiction.
Right.
I was thinking now just about N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. And that story is fundamentally about a person's experience of great tragedy facing their planet. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about fantasy, is that you're able to create a giant metaphor for something that may be going on in the real world right now. Like, I mean, like at its core, Broken Earth feels like an alien place, but they're experiencing great environmental disaster, which we are facing on this planet right now as well. And it creates those shared language for people to talk about things that they're experiencing as they see these characters go through them as well.
Well, and even it's Gaia Awakens, the anthology that you mentioned earlier. I mean, that's, I assume there's like science fiction, science fantasy going on there.
Exactly.
And it does give us a way, I think, in both genres to put the stakes up there in a controlled way and give us sort of a safe place to think about these things. And you do separate out things like today's politics, not always, because that's going to be in the story, but it gives you just a place to go. You're sort of escaping from where you're at, but this gives you sort of a little mental playground to work through some of those things. And I think it's really cool to be able to do that. I think we're going to continue to see, like, you look at the dystopian, like futuristic sci-fi, where, we better not, keep going on this path, or we're going to have tyrannical governments and all this. And some people would say we're not far off from that today. Whereas, a lot of fantasy, the governments are ruled by a king or queen or some kind of monarchy with an absolute, iron fist. And so you see these parallels in the two genres, and I think it's just really interesting. I'm having a lot of fun delving into both.
Yeah, and I think this instinct for people to create these fantastical scenarios is like actually very, very human. I mean, like arguably one of the first, actually, I mean, I was about to say the Iliad, but you could go even further back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, where humans have been injecting these fantastical explanations and like things to represent universal truths for a really long time. And like, I mean, because like Greek mythology is like, is like infested with metaphors for the way the world works. And I was listening to a book just the other day talking about how there's a metaphor where one Greek, I think, goddess like goes into the underworld and returns every year, and that's actually, the Greeks interpreted that as a representation of the harvest, where you plant seeds in the ground and then it comes back every year. And it's like this sort of instinct to create these explanations that are metaphors for things that we experience in the real world is a way to get people to understand these sorts of universal truths. Now, obviously, we have like a scientific understanding of plants growing now, and the way that we tell myth and story is very different from what it was in the past. But I think that's like what's really cool about both science fiction and fantasy, is that we're kind of reimagining how humans could experience the world.
Yep. Really cool stuff. I think we could talk about it forever.
Yes.
CD. But appreciate you coming on and talking about this. How about you pitch Gaia Awakens, I think is what it's called again?
Yeah, Gaia
Four
Awakens,
times.
a climate crisis anthology. It's going to be releasing in early November. I think the exact date's November 9th. It was originally on Kickstarter, where we were able to fund enough for every author who participated to get paid 1 cent per word of their stories. Was really excited about that. But the ebook will be releasing and the paperback, and we're actually going to have a hardcover version as well at the beginning of November. Really exciting. If you're an author tuning in, check out our website. Our submission window is closed right now, but I think we're thinking about what we want the next opportunity to look like, and I've got a lot of really great ideas in my mind about where we could go this. I'm excited to see what sort of stories people can tell. The important thing to know, it's all one setting. All the stories are connected, and it's been a lot of fun. It's sci-fi and fantasy, so all that mixed together.
Super cool. Link will, again, in the description. Check it out. Appreciate it again, CD. Appreciate everyone who stuck around this long, and I will catch you all next time.